Thanks for joining us for this Ivory Egg presentation on invisible speakers and Cerasonar. I'm Ramashan Thraja. In the first session, we'll be covering invisible speakers, their traditional limitations and issues, and how Cerasonar have overcome those. And in the second session, we'll be having a look at the Cerasonar product range and discussing how to specify those correctly. So without further ado, let's start part one. So the biggest drawback that invisible speakers have traditionally had is quality of sound, something that's absolutely essential to a speaker. They've traditionally been quite curtailed in terms of the amount and the depth of bass, and often quite curtailed in terms of the high frequency response as well. So what we've ended up with is actually very, very poor quality of sound in comparison to traditional in-wall and ceiling speakers. Now, over the last couple of years, we've seen that change. Cerasonar in particular have some unique technologies which have allowed them to deliver a quality of sound, in fact, superior in many instances to what we'd experience with a traditional in-wall and ceiling speaker. The first issue is size. Because most people don't want to see a large and ugly grille in their ceiling or the walls, often we're very limited in terms of the size of in-wall or in-ceiling speaker we can put in using the traditional means. So often we're limited to a 8-inch, 6.5-inch or 5.25-inch speaker. And with that size of speaker, you simply can't get truly deep, extended dynamic bass, high volumes, or a really room-filling sound. Now, the beauty of an invisible speaker, of course, is it doesn't matter what size the speaker is because you don't see it. So this allows us to put in a much larger radiating surface, which allows us to get much deeper bass, better dynamics, and launch a lot more sound so we can get a truly room-filling sound. So let's have a look at some of the special technologies which make Cerasonar so good. The first is distributed mode loudspeakers. So a traditional speaker uses a pistonic motion. So if you can imagine the cone, it moves in and out to essentially pressurize and depressurize the air to create sound. Now, this has got some issues for the longevity of the installation, but it's also got some other drawbacks. Let's have a quick look at DML. What that does by comparison, rather than the whole diaphragm moving in and out, it sets up vibrations within the diaphragm. So essentially, you can imagine the radiating surface being made out of thousands of tiny little radiating points, each launching sound into the room. Now that's got some big benefits for the longevity of the installation, which we will cover shortly. But from a sound quality point of view, it does a couple of really important things. One, we get very, very good dispersion of the sound. So the sound leaves the radiating surface with 180 degrees horizontally and vertically. So we get very good dispersion through the room. Now, this is important because often in walls and in ceilings, we're very limited to where we can put the speakers because we need to work around air conditioning vents, lighting, and other ceiling acme. The beautiful thing about this DML technology and that wonderful dispersion is that we can place them in non-ideal positions and still get very good coverage of sound through the room. The second thing is the way that volume declines with distance from the speaker is different with this sort of technology to a traditional pistonic motion. So with the traditional sort of speakers, you know, as distance from the speaker increases, the volume you hear drops off quite markedly. With DML, we don't have that. The way it pressurizes and depressurizes a room, the way it spreads sound through the room, in other words, is different. And what it means is we get much more even dispersion of sound through the room. So that means you don't get the hot spots where volume is very high directly underneath or very close to a speaker, and very quiet at further distances. So again, it gives us much better, more even coverage of sound through the room. Second technology is the Eaton hexagon diaphragms, which Cerasonar have bought the patents from. So Eaton hexagon diaphragms were a big deal in the 80s. They were quite a revolutionary technology. Cerasonar bought the patents to them and has continued to develop them. And it's a technology that only they really use in invisible speakers. What this does is it allows them to create an extremely strong but extremely light diaphragm. So that gives us dramatically improved quality of sound, but we'll also see later that's got some installation benefits. Third, as any audiophile or hi-fi buff will know, one of the biggest sources of inefficiency and distortion in a traditional speaker is the crossovers. The crossover is the passive circuit generally, which splits the sound to the high frequency drivers, the tweeters, the mid-range drivers, or the bass drivers. And around these crossover points where we have transition from one driver to the other, you get all sorts of phase and other quality and performance anomalies. With the DML technology from Cerasonar, a single radiating surface covers all of the frequencies. So we get none of the phase distortions, none of the inefficiencies that we get from multi-driver crossover designs, and we get a much more seamless sound from the top to the bottom of the frequency range. Lastly, mode control correction. So the black zigzagged surface around the perimeter of the speaker stops standing waves and other distortions within the radiating panel for improved quality of sound. This technology is available on the Ultimate and Reference series in Cerasonar, but isn't included in the Fixed series. You'll also notice the little orange clip-ins for the cables on the rear. Those circular black units behind the orange clip-ins are the transducers or drivers, which again are proprietary to Cerasonar to set out that DML vibration within the radiating surface. So the use of all of these technologies has allowed Cerasonar to achieve very good quality of sound, often as good or better than from a traditional in-wall or in-ceiling. The second thing it's done is it's allowed them to overcome the second big issue that invisible speakers have traditionally had, and that is expense. So traditionally, up till quite recently, most invisible speakers have been several times the cost of an equivalent in-wall or in-ceiling speaker and delivered lower quality of sound. So it's only really made them appropriate for clients or for people who care most about the aesthetics and are really not too concerned about the quality of sound. But Cerasonar, now the price differences come down sufficiently that it's really a minimal extra cost to go for the extra beauty and elegance of a truly invisible solution, and the quality of sound can be as good, if not better. Third big issue has been around installations and reliability. So many other invisible speaker brands have had issues with cracking of the plaster and paste around the speaker because the diaphragm is moved relative to the surrounding material of the ceiling or the walls. Now, the DML technology that Cerasonar use has allowed them to deliver very, very high volumes, often over 100 dB, with minuscule movement of the diaphragm, less than 0.3 of a single millimeter of excursion, even at those maximum 100 dB plus volume levels. So the issues with plasters and paints cracking around a speaker is no longer an issue with Cerasonar. The next issue is about reliability. Other speaker manufacturers have had issues with reliability of their in-ceiling speakers. And unlike a traditional in-wall or in-ceiling, which can just be dropped out and easily replaced should something go wrong, it's a much bigger deal if something goes wrong with an invisible speaker. The speaker needs to be cut out of place, a new one plastered in place, the wall then repainted. So that can be a very costly and quite disruptive exercise. Cerasonar speakers are designed and built in Germany to a very, very high quality, and every single speaker is tested in the factory for a minimum of half a day before leaving the factory to guarantee product quality. So we're told by Cerasonar, and we've got no reason to disbelieve them at this point, we've never had a failure, and Cerasonar tell us that they have never had a speaker fail due to manufacturing defect. But manufacturing defect is not the only thing that can go wrong with a speaker. Let's say mum and dad are away for the weekend, the kids have a party, they drive the amplifier to 1,000,000 o'clock, and the amplifier goes into distortion. That distortion can damage a speaker. Or if there's a power surge or a lightning strike or something similar and the amplifier fails catastrophically, that again can put distortion or DC down the speaker cables and destroy the speaker. And once again, unlike a traditional in-wall and ceiling speaker, it's a much bigger deal to have to replace those. If you're using one of their amplifiers, as pictured on the right, they have very, very good protection built on board to protect the speaker in the case of one of those eventualities. If you're using a third-party amplifier, they've got a small off-board protection unit, as pictured on the left, which lives behind the amplifier in the cabinet or the rack. So even if something does catastrophically fail, it's easy to repair or replace the protection unit. The last issue is around the robustness of the diaphragm. So many of the invisible speakers up to now, the diaphragms have been quite light and quite fragile. Now, this isn't such an issue if they're in the ceiling, but if they're in the wall, it can be. So there have been instances where people have leant on the speaker, or the kid's been kicking a ball around, or there's been some other kind of impact on the wall, and the diaphragms have been damaged and left a hole in the wall. And again, this can be a big deal, having to cut that out, install a new speaker, plaster over it, and repaint that wall or that ceiling. With the Eaton diaphragm technology that we've discussed previously, although those diaphragms are very, very light, they're also extremely strong, stronger than the surrounding jib in general, so you don't have any of those issues that have afflicted other invisible speakers in the past. So in conclusion, those specific Cerasonar technologies that we've discussed have addressed all of the concerns and reservations and drawbacks that we've seen in invisible speakers from the vast majority of manufacturers up till this point. So we're now in a position where we can provide a truly invisible solution, very discreet, very elegant, with quality of sound that is as good or better than a traditional in-wall or in-ceiling for a very, very small price increase. In the next section, we'll be covering the Cerasonar product range and explaining how and when to specify each product. We look forward to joining you then. Thank you.